Curious Lloyd.
Most people become fascinated by crime movie and TV show plot twists, although sometimes they can happen right in front of us without you even noticing. For example, these 5 real-life crime cases have movie-like twists that will definitely get you on the edge of your seat. Poetic clues surrounding a murder victim are actually a church's bizarre game. When a couple of joggers in Florida stumbled upon a parked car occupied by a strangled Colombian guy, they decided to call the police. Upon arriving, the investigators noticed a plastic bag taped to a nearby no dumping road sign. In the bag was a cryptic poem. Once you're back on track, you'll travel in night, so prepare your old self for a terrible fright. Now the motive is clear, and the victim is too. You've got all the answers, just follow the clues. The investigators solved the first puzzle, but they soon unearthed the second poem, which read, "Yes, Matthew is dead, but his body not felt. Those brains were not Matt's, because his body did melt. For Billy threw Matt in some hot boiling oil. To confuse the police for this mystery, they did toil." So you're probably thinking, how does a strangled Colombian guy in a car link to an apparent deep-fried male called Matthew? Was he another victim? How many were there? In their effort to find out how deep the rabbit hole went, the police approached the Miami Herald, which ran a story about the case, and asked anyone if they knew anything else about these murder poems. And as it turned out, somebody did. So to calm your minds, the twist was in fact the church. The church did it. They wrote the poems. That's it. But they didn't kill the Colombian. The poems were completely unrelated to the murder, and the only reason the one of them was in the vicinity of the victim was because he was blind. Representatives of a local church called in and revealed that the cryptic poems were nothing but reminders of a Halloween party, for which several church members made up a load of elaborate mysteries for kids to solve. This particular mystery, which by now was known in the media as the Liquid Matthew case, although the only reason the notes were still hanging around was that it rained on the night of the game and no one could be bothered to go and clean up all the murder notes thrown onto the floor. The dead guy was eventually identified as Francisco Patino Gutierrez, and an informant revealed he was a seaman who had allegedly smuggled 11 pounds of cocaine into Miami and had gotten killed for his efforts. A woman realizes her mother in fact kidnapped her as a baby. Imagine going to your mother and asking for a completely innocuous document for a routine governmental procedure, and she responds by pulling out the rug from under everything you ever known. Like, if you needed her signature for something serious, and she couldn't sign it because she was a hologram. Well, something even weirder happened to Nedra Nance when she became pregnant as a teenager. Nedra needed her own birth certificate so she could apply for parental care, so she asked her mum, whose name was Anne Petway. Instead of the certificate, Petway hit Nedra. Not only did she not have the document, but Nedra wasn't her daughter at all. Petway told Nedra that she'd been given to her by a random drug addict, although this was a lie, and the truth was even worse. But here comes the absurd twist. Nedra kept digging, and her research eventually took her to a website of the National Center of Missing and Exploited Children, where she found a picture of a baby who looked strangely like her. Petway wasn't Nedra's mother, or even a surrogate mother. She was her kidnapper. Nedra's real name was Kalina White, and the woman she'd always called Mum was a random person with mental health issues, who one day decided she was going to grab herself a baby. On the 4th of August 1987, Petway disguised herself as a nurse, walked into a hospital, and counselled the mother of a 19-day-old baby. Then once everyone's backs were turned, she proceeded to steal the baby. She provided her with a good upbringing and wasn't motivated by hate. She did, however, have a history of failed pregnancies and was desperate for a child. But in all fairness, she did abduct a child practically from her mother's arms and forced it to live a lie. So no matter how nice you can be, she's still a monster in my eyes. Kalina's kidnapped mother was arrested and sentenced to 12 years in prison. Despite the real parents' calls for her to be imprisoned every year she took Kalina away from them. As for Kalina, she immediately distanced herself from the case. A police officer is identified as the killer at the crime scene she was investigating. In New Orleans, 1995, there had been an armed robbery of a restaurant, and an off-duty officer had been shot. The police swarmed the scene, knowing a cop killer might be on the loose. The first officer on the scene finds a witness and asks her what happened. The witness looks at her like she's crazy and replies, "You know what happened. You were there." So this case goes to 0 to 100 real quick. Not only had the cop been there, she was the killer. As it turns out, the officer, Antoinette Frank, had a friend, a 19-year-old drug dealer called Rogers Lacaze. Frank and Lacaze had devised a plan to rob a Vietnamese restaurant where Frank moonlighted as a security guard. Of course, they chose a night she wasn't working, and of course, the place was guarded by another police officer. Frank and Lacaze immediately shot the cop, who was from Frank's precinct and had even partnered previously, and also executed 2 other potential witnesses, a young man and woman working in the restaurant, before fleeing the scene. The family had considered Frank as a trusted friend, and she had eaten in the restaurant an hour before the shootings. No one knows for sure how Frank ended up back on the scene, but here's the investigator's best guess. She was worried that a few potential witnesses might still be around, and she needed to go back and finish the job before the rest of the police showed up. So she dropped off Lacaze and rushed to the police station to request a car, telling them that she needed to assist an officer who was down, which to be fair was technically correct. However, one of the 2 remaining restaurant workers had run off to call the police, and the other one only came out of his hiding place right as the other police entered the scene. Now forced to play the role of an actual cop, Frank asked what had happened, and the victim immediately called her out on it, so Frank was arrested at the scene and now holds the distinction of being one of the 55 women on death row. A rapist doctor tricks Canadian CSI by implanting fake blood into his arm. Kipling, Saskatchewan is home to 1,100 residents and also has the world's largest paperclip and a villain called Dr. John Schneerberger, whose preferred pastimes included doctoring and horrific sexual assault. In 1992, Dr. Schneerberger subdued a woman with powerful anesthetics in his examination room, and then, in 1994, he repeated the deed with a second victim. In 1995, he abused the second victim again, because like I've said in my serial killer videos, psychopaths can't even conceive of even getting caught. So the doctor did virtually nothing to cover up or hide his crimes, and the victims even went to the police. So the police just needed to send a lab technician to get DNA samples from Schneerberg, and society would be free, and he'd be locked in a cell. Although, that didn't happen at all. The DNA from the blood sample the lab tech brought back from the doctor in 1992 wasn't a match. Schneerberg walked away scot-free. A second attempt in 1993 yielded the exact same result. A third try came in 1996, with another big mismatch, but nothing CSI related could link the doctor to crimes in any way. But eventually, after the third failed sample, the police got curious and decided to take a sample of the doctor's hair and use that instead. Upon testing the hair, police determined that Schneerberg was the rapist from all 3 episodes. But the question remained how he had managed to literally change his blood, which he literally did by sticking a tube of someone else's blood into his arm. It turns out that being an evil doctor allows for easier access to certain equipment most people wouldn't expect. So for example, having access to bags of human blood. Schneerberger's genius method to avoid capture was to take blood from one of his male patients, stick it into a tube, and slip that tube into his arm, right next to his vein. But how did he get away with it? Did he perform some kind of skilled sleight of hand trick? Or did he calmly roll up his sleeve, show the hapless technician the plastic tube, and say, yeah, here we go, take my blood? But no, that would have required skill and planning, and Schneerberger didn't have time for that, so he simply offered to draw the blood himself, and the technician complied 3 separate times. So, live and learn, I say. A crime writer's co-worker turns out to be a notorious serial killer. In 1971, former police officer and upcoming true crime writer Anne Rule decided to distance herself from the gore-happy details of her day job and the various disasters of her personal life by doing some good in the community, which was volunteering as a suicide hotline operator for one night a week. There, she made fast friends with a handsome young fellow volunteer. Rule and this young man worked together often and became fairly close, and he told Rule some of his most personal stories, like tales about his background as an illegitimate child, plans to get his girlfriend back, and how his grandmother strangely pretended she was his mum, so usual friend stuff. But Rule was still a crime writer by trade, and a few years later, she was working on a book about a string of unsolved murders of women in the Washington area. But while investigating, Rule noticed that one of the women had heard the killer call himself Ted, which was the name of the young good-hearted guy she had worked with on the suicide hotline. So the most bizarre thing about this case, that this guy's full name was Ted Bundy. The similar name and physical description of the killer wasn't enough to make Rule believe that Ted was the culprit, but the guy was volunteering to save the lives of depressed people. But it alarmed her enough that she decided to give the police a call. She told the investigator about Bundy, who unbeknownst to her, turned out to own the exact same model of the Volkswagen Beetle as the killer. But unnerved, Rule asked for a tip to remain anonymous, which was probably a pretty good move on her part, because the next year, Ted contacted her, presumably because he knew about Rule's crime journalist career. He wanted to know why the police were suddenly looking into his law school records. But Rule checked and found that he was one of 1,200 suspects that the law was looking into. So seemingly happy with the information, Bundy told Rule, "I think they have some kind of wild idea I'm connected with some of the cases up in Washington. Everything's going to turn out alright, but if it doesn't, you'll be reading about me in the papers." But it turns out, she did read about him when he was arrested. Bundy eventually confessed to 30 murders and may have committed many more. But if you want to delve in deep into Bundy's story, then make sure you watch my documentary of him, or click in the top right now.